Today's scripture comes from the Gospel of Matthew. We're going to be looking at Matthew chapter 8, starting at verse 14. This is a moment where Jesus is going about in the middle of his ministry. Matthew chapter 8, starting at verse 14, it says, "When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. And she got up and began to wait on him. When evening had come, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word, and he healed all of the sick. This was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. He took up our infirmities, and he bore our disease." When Jesus saw the crowd around him, he gave orders to cross to the other side of the lake, that is the Sea of Galilee. And then a teacher of the law came to him and said, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus replied, "Foxes have dens, and birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head." Another disciple came to him, "Lord, first let me go and bury my father." But Jesus told him, "Follow me, and let the dead bury their own dead." Then he got into the boat, and his disciples followed him. And suddenly a furious storm came upon the lake, so that the waves swept over the boat. But Jesus, he was sleeping. And the disciples went and they woke him, saying, "Lord, save us! We are going to drown." And he replied, "You of little faith, why are you so afraid?" And then he got up and he rebuked the winds and the waves, and it was completely calm. And the men were amazed, and they asked, "What kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him." This is the word of the Lord. Well, today we gather as the church. We gather as the children of God. We're known as Christians, and what that means literally is little Christs. Did you know that? That term Christian started in Antioch, shortly after the church had begun. And I think it's a very fitting name for people who are called to be representatives of Jesus. Just a mini version who's walking around in the same likeness. And throughout the ministry of Jesus, he finds certain people from the crowd, and he singles them out and he says, "Come, follow me." And this call begins a journey of discipleship as these people would become students of Jesus, their teacher or rabbi, and they would become a mini Jesus. And they would learn the way of Jesus, how he lived his life. And that brings us to us today, where we continue this journey of discipleship as we learn the life of Jesus, how he lived, and we learn how to live what he calls life to the full, a life truly worth living. As disciples of Jesus, there are three expectations. One is that we would be with Jesus. Then there's the expectation that we would become like Jesus. And finally, we would begin to do as Jesus did. That is the call of a disciple. It's not just come and follow. There's a lot more to what it means to follow Jesus. So as we look at several moments throughout the life of Jesus and his ministry, we see that there are a few insights on what it means to live in the way of Jesus. In this passage here, we are able to see that, there's lives to these disciples. If I were to ask you how many of the 12 disciples can you name, Well, we start off pretty strong and confident. Well, there's Peter and Andrew, James and John. There was Judas, then there was that other Judas. And then, wait, how do we start going down? And because their names on a page for a lot of us. But as we continue to study the way of Jesus and the ministry, we begin to learn these aren't just names, these are lives. These are people. We see a little bit of that here today. We also see how a life with Jesus can be a miraculous thing. How there can be awe and wonder and things you could not believe if you weren't there to see it yourself or you had a step of faith. And most importantly, I think, what we're going to be talking about today is we also see that there is a cost that comes with discipleship. The German theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer wrote a book once called The Cost of Discipleship, and in it he writes, "When Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die." This cost is something we don't always like to talk about, and it can be a sobering thing to think. But it looks a little bit differently depending on who you are. I know it's not quite as warm right now as it may have been in May. We're starting a little bit cooler of a June, but it's still certainly a lot warmer than December, right? But pretend with me, let's use our imagination and think back to Christmas, or maybe, if you're eager, we're thinking ahead to Christmas. That's not quite where I am. But let's think about Christmas. Think about Santa Claus, the happy old elf, old Saint Nick. If you're unfamiliar, Santa Claus is inspired by the life of a man named Saint Nicholas. He was born in Turkey in 270 AD, a long time ago. And yet we still remember him today through the character of Santa Claus. And the story of Saint Nicholas is this. Very quickly, Saint Nicholas was born into a family, but his parents died when he was very young. Important to know about his family is that his parents were quite wealthy, and because of that, he inherited a vast amount of wealth. And he lived as a disciple of Jesus, and for him, he believed that Jesus was calling him to use his inherited wealth for the sake of others and to give gifts regularly. And he did. One of the most famous stories of Nicholas is when he came across, walking through town, and he learned of a father who had 3 daughters. But all of them wanted to get married, but the father couldn't afford the dowry for any of his daughters. So one night he walks by and he throws a bag of gold through the window. Amazing. And he carries on. He's not here to make a name for himself. He just wants to be generous. And he believes that he is called to sacrifice. So he carries on. And he does it again for the second daughter, a second bag of gold. And this father is suddenly so overcome. He says, I must know who this man is, who is blessing us so much. So he stays up all night waiting by the window. And Nicholas notices, and he doesn't want to have the name for himself. That's not the purpose of it. So what does he do but climb up onto the roof? And he drops a bag of gold through the chimney, which just so happens to land in one of the stockings that was hung out to dry. And now we have the story of St. Nicholas, Santa Claus. But for him, this is an example of the cost of discipleship. I'm not asking you to throw gold around, but if you do, find me. I'll give you my address later. But think about these disciples. We started this journey with the first disciples, Peter and Andrew, James and John. These were 4 fishermen. And when Jesus comes and he says, "Come and follow me," they all get up and abandon their boats and their nets. And James and John leave their father in the boat. They get up and they leave. And they begin their lives of sacrifice for Jesus. There was a cost to it. Will you leave your boat and your net behind? Now, I don't believe that Jesus will just call sacrifice just for the sake of taking away something. There's always more to it than that. Jesus doesn't want to just take away our good things and to make us suffer. But I believe that what he calls us to is to take sometimes our ultimate things and sacrifice those. And he becomes the ultimate thing in our life. And he takes these other good things and he rearranges them and places them in an appropriate place. Look at these disciples. Look at Peter specifically. In this text, we know that, one, Peter has a house, but also he has a mother-in-law. What would that imply? Peter is married. Peter has a family, he has a house, and when they get into a boat later on, it's usually believed, well, it's Peter's boat. The same boat that he got up and he left. So what's that about? James and John have a similar situation where we know elsewhere in the story that their mom comes up to Jesus and she begins talking to Jesus, asking things of Jesus. We know they may have left their father in the boat, but of course he's still a part of the story. They still have their family, their work life, but these things now, from the perspective of the gospel, they're secondary. These are no longer fishermen. They are disciples of Jesus who have a boat, they have nets, they go fishing. But the primary role is a disciple of Jesus, and all of a sudden the rest of their lives goes in line with Jesus. I have no doubts that Peter's family play an important role throughout his life and in his ministry. But here, I think it's amazing to read that Jesus came into Peter's home, saw his mother-in-law sick, and heals her. And a few verses later, it says this was to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet Isaiah. That he took our infirmities and he bore our disease. There were others, but also through Peter's mother-in-law, the prophet's words are fulfilled. That's a whole lot more than the identity found in family. Now it goes beyond and it goes towards the kingdom of God being fulfilled because of this family. Now, as the story continues, we see, evening had come when many people were brought and were healed. And now it's still evening. Jesus sees this crowd around him and he gives orders to cross the other side of the water. So he calls his disciples, "Come and follow me." And suddenly we see that there is a harsh reality to following Jesus. And we also hear words that sound very sharp from our teacher's mouth, from Jesus, so tender and mild. Now there are very sharp words when there are two men who come to him. One, first, he is a teacher himself, a teacher of the law, and he says, "Teacher, I will follow you wherever you go." You can practically hear the excitement in his voice. You can see his eyes as they shine as he looks at Jesus after witnessing everything he has seen. Maybe he was listening to the teaching as a teacher himself and thinks, "This is amazing. I've never heard someone like him before. I will follow you wherever you go." And Jesus looks at the man and he says, "You're naive." At least that's how I read it. Where Jesus says, don't think that a life alongside me is going to be filled with healing and fame and wealth and comfort just because you now are hearing a good teacher and seeing healing. That doesn't mean that this is going to be easy. Of course, if it was, why wouldn't you follow me wherever I go? But Jesus says there is a cost to discipleship. If you come with me, you aren't going to have fame and wealth and comfort. I don't have a place to lay my head. I am entirely dependent on others. As he stayed in the house of one of his disciples. As I look at this teacher, as he eagerly says, I will follow you wherever you go, I was reminded of the other disciples of Jesus, where Peter himself once says, even if all fall away on account of you, Jesus, I never will. Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you. And he goes on to deny him 3 times. Or James and John, they were once asked by Jesus, can you drink from the same cup that I drink, a cup of suffering? And they eagerly responded by saying, we can. And yet they don't really understand what they're saying. In that moment, they are naive. Foxes have dens, birds have nests, but the Son of Man has no place to lay his head, because a life with Jesus can be very costly. Looks a little bit different for everyone. But there is a cost to discipleship. We go on to see that James and John do end up drinking from this cup of suffering. And so does Peter. And he would go on and deny Jesus. In a way, I take comfort in knowing that everyone, even the very first disciples, they make mistakes. I make mistakes, don't get me wrong, and I'm sure you do too. We all make mistakes. But if we say to Jesus, I will follow you wherever you go, and we have the expectation that it means it's going to be easy, and Jesus says, you're naive. It's not going to be easy all the time. There may be some incredible moments, but those are passing. This is the first man. Then there's a second man, another disciple. And as he comes, he says, Jesus, I'll follow you, but not yet. Wait for a moment. Wait until I'm ready. This man is offering a condition. As I've looked at this passage over the years, I've read a few different scholars who suggest that this man's father's not actually dead. If he was, this man would not be with Jesus in this moment. He didn't go for healing. He didn't go for even resurrection. He is with Jesus, and he says, before you go, it seems like it's going to be a long trip, getting on the boat, crossing the water. Let's wait. My father, maybe he's sick. Maybe he's older. Maybe there's a reason to think he might die soon. We don't really know for sure. But we have a pretty good idea of saying, this man is still alive. And there is who knows how long this disciple is truly asking Jesus to wait. We don't know for sure. But he's not saying, let me go and bury my father now. He's saying, Jesus, on my terms, I'll let you know when I'm ready to follow. We read this passage from Matthew. If we jumped over to Luke, we would see that Jesus actually specifically calls this disciple. He says, come, follow me. And this disciple, he seems willing, but he hesitates. And he ends up missing his chance. Keep in mind, it is already evening. Jesus has already said, we are crossing over, and Jesus is getting in the boat. He is on his mission. He is moving. And he calls the disciple, join me, get in the boat, and let's go. And the man asks Jesus to stop. But that's not how it works. The kingdom of God is already moving. And it's not going to wait. The question is, will you join? Are you going to get in or stay out? Another history lesson for you from the Roman Emperor Constantine. He is known for a lot of things. One of the things he's known for here in the church is that he made Christianity the official Roman religion. He legalized Christianity, and otherwise it had been persecuted and unrecognized. And through this action, Constantine, he seems to claim that he believes the validity of Jesus, but he doesn't actually live as a disciple of Jesus. He refuses to follow the life of Jesus. He doesn't get baptized, not until later. He seems to affirm the message of Jesus, but he doesn't live by it, not until he's on his deathbed, where he gets baptized, so that he could live his own way throughout the rest of his life. He says, I will follow you, but on my timing. I'll let you know when we can go. And I know that there are others who may live this way too. Say, well, I'll think about church later. Maybe I'll, start praying when I get older. I think there's another sense of naivety there too, where you could only assume that you know when your life is ending. But even if you could, Jesus is promising life to the full. And you can have it here and now. Why would you settle to wait until the end? I think you miss out on a lot. Because Jesus is already in the boat. He's going to do incredible things. And the question is, will you get in the boat or not? But there's the reality that there is a cost to discipleship. For our disciples here in the story, we see that they give up their security, they give up their previous identity, and now we see that they also go into a place where their safety is in jeopardy. They get in the boat, and they end up in the middle of a storm. I think we can all see that we follow Jesus not because he promises an easy life. Unfortunately, that's something that the church in some places has said in the past, but it's not true. The other week we looked at the story of the wise and the foolish builder. For both of them, storms came. Floods rose. It doesn't matter. What does matter is what your foundation is built upon. And for these disciples, they end up once again in a storm. Because Jesus does not promise an easy life. So why do we follow Jesus? Not because he promises an easy life, but because of who he is. It's on this trip across the water. We have Peter and Andrew, James and John, fishermen, sailors, who are in this boat, and they are in a storm that they cannot manage. And they're overwhelming these seafarers with these winds and the waves. To the point where the disciples are terrified, and they wake up Jesus saying, "Save us, we're going to drown." In a way, part of me asks, they're about to be amazed. Why did they wake up Jesus? I've always thought that's curious. But in their time of trouble, they turn to Jesus. And what do they find? Their teacher is asleep in one of the worst storms they've ever seen. The storm that would have caused them to die. And he's asleep in total peace. And when they wake up Jesus and they beg for help, he gets up and he says, "Peace, be still." And the storm stops. And the waters are calm. And notice in verse 27, the men were amazed and they asked, "What kind of man is this?" I think that is the perfect question they could have asked. What kind of man is this? Amazed not by the waters being stilled, but amazed because someone commanded the waters to stand still, and it did. What kind of man is this? Who could possibly cause the winds and the waves to kneel? Who could possibly cause mountains to bow? The reality is, if you've ever tried to stop a storm by saying, "Be still," you know that's not how it works. They don't listen to human voices, do they? And yet, they listened to this man. Winds and waves don't kneel to people. Mountains don't bow to people. And yet, they listen to no man but the Son of Man. To the creator of the heavens and the earth, the one who holds all things together, the King of the universe. That is who they listen to. And now Jesus, the master and the teacher, says, "Peace, be still." And it is. And there is peace and there is security. We follow Jesus not because of what he can do for us, but because of who he is. And this is the same Jesus, our master and our teacher, the one who we say we live our whole lives for. And he displays personally what it means to sacrifice and submit to the will of God the Father. When in a garden he says, "Father, not my will be done, but yours." Where on a cross he would give up his very life. And he offers salvation at the highest cost. And in a tomb, he rises from the dead. And he brings life to anyone who would join him. That is the kind of life of sacrifice and the cost that we sign up for when we get in that boat. When Jesus calls a man to follow, he bids him come and die. Because we don't follow Jesus for what he can do for us. He offers us life to the full, but that's not why we follow. And this life to the full can be very costly sometimes. There is a cost to discipleship.